Okay. So I thought um I would save the section on the lit review for when we go actually hand in the lit review. Um but we're going to start looking at the methods section, and I also want to look at Mark. All right. Also want to look at um I want to look at D2L where it says gives us our final paper outline for the methods section. Okay, so for the lit review, you're going to have everything from the title page down to the end of the lit review. And we've already gone over the definition section in a previous class. And so we're going to skip ahead. We're going to wait on the model. Uh, we're going to do all that together. But just because the book flows through the methods section next, that's the last section of your final paper. That's called the proposed study. And so we're going to start talking about that. So as we talk about this, um, think about writing that section of your paper. I know your minds are already uh, focused on the lit review. But as we talk about this, just think about your own population that you want to use your model with, and think about how we might figure out, will your model work with this population? How am I going to know um, about the efficacy of your model? Will your model help people? Okay. Well, chances are it will, because you're already researching individual theories that help your population. So if you combine a few of those and add something original of your own, then chances are it will work. But we still have to study it. We still have to prove that it will work. So, you know, uh, when we think about methods, um, one of the first things we think about is, okay, so a method is the method of a study or the method of measuring the results of a study. So when we're thinking about your proposed study, remember, you don't have to run this study, you know. Um, all you have to do is propose it. The way I think about proposing a study is I always, if I'm going to run a study, I want it to be paid for, including my time. So, I usually think about running a study and applying for a grant. So, if you write this, write it in a way that, you know, you've got this great model, you want to use it to help these people in a certain population. But the next step is we'd like to propose a study to see if it works or not. And, you know, think about how you would say all this in like a grant application, basically. That's that's kind of the best way to look at a proposed study. Um, and you don't have to run it. All you have to do is propose it. So the first thing we think about is your population. And so far in your lit review, you've already identified a population. Okay, so it could be adolescents in codependent relationships. It could be, um, you know, a new comprehensive model for treating autism spectrum disorder, children with autism spectrum disorder. So it could be anything you want, anything you're already writing about in the lit review. But we're going to define the population a little more. So we're just going to define it for your study. Okay. So right now you're talking about a population based on an issue. Okay. Could have an age to it. It could be like adolescence. Um, could have a diagnosis or an issue like autism spectrum. It could have, codependency, whatever it is, it's fine. But now we're going to narrow it down. Okay, how are we going to run a study? Because we can't include everybody in the population. That's impossible. The United States is a huge country, even if we just stay with the United States. Even Pennsylvania is a big state. Now, I was really lucky. Like when I wrote a dissertation, my population was all Presbyterian ministers. That's what I wanted to study. And I was fortunate that I wrote the proposal and I sent it into the national organization and told them I wanted to run a study. And they gave me the address and email and contact info of every Presbyterian minister in the United States. So that was just pretty lucky. But even that, I was a poor grad student. I couldn't afford to send this to everyone. So I had to think about how am I going to narrow this down and still have it represent the larger population. So that's the key. How are you going to have a sample of the larger population that represents the larger population? So the magic number, if you're doing quantitative study, is you want between 150 and 200 participants. If you're sending out like a survey, you might expect a 10% response rate, but ministers feel guilty if they don't respond. So I got like, I don't know, 75% response rate. So, know your population. Uh, and, but, the normal response rate for a survey is very low. There are tricks. You can send them $1. That ups it by like 10%. Because it's like they're not going to send the $1 back and they want to keep the $1. All right, I'll fill out the survey. It's only going to take 10 minutes, So you can play on their emotions a little bit, but even that gets expensive. So you could be a little cheaper. You can send them something like a pen, something like that. Any token increases your response rate. So let's say you want between 150 and 200 participants, and you're using some type of survey. So you actually have to send it out to many, many more, probably 10 times as many. If you're thinking about a 10% response rate, you got to send it out to 10 times as many. So 10 times 200 is 2,000. Okay. And you'll probably get between 150 or 200 back. So in your proposed study, we're going to talk a little bit about pre-test, post-test, running groups, doing individual counseling, that kind of stuff. But the next thing you want to think about is, well, what about location? because you're probably going to be doing more than a survey. You're probably actually going to have counseling, because you want to try out your new counseling model. You want to have, groups that don't use it and use whatever they were using before. And you're going to have groups that are using your model. And you're probably going to give them some type of measurement before you start counseling and after your counseling's done, 8 to 12 weeks later. That way you can see if there's any improvement. So that's called pre-test, post-test. So when we think about this, think about location, and you might as well make this realistic if you're going to write it up. You never know, in the future, you might work for an agency and, you might say, hey, I did this comprehensive model back in school. And the agency might have an awful lot of clients. They might have 3,000, 4,000 clients. So you might you might designate the region Western Pennsylvania. You might designate your region the Pittsburgh area. You might go by county. You might say Washington County or Westmoreland County or something like that. Allegheny County. You might do it by school districts, So there's lots of ways to designate the area that you want to measure or glean your sample from. So you might just think about where you want to try this out. So what I did was I didn't just send it to every minister. I couldn't do that. So what I decided to do is I randomly chose 4 people from each of the 50 states, and I sent it out to 200 people. Now you can also decide kind of what variables would be important. Like in ministry in the early 1990s, there were a lot more male ministers. Now there's a lot more female ministers. Just like counseling, there was a lot more male counselors 35 years ago. Now we're at over 90% female counselors. So times have changed. And I think probably for the better. But so one thing I wanted to do, I didn't want to get all male responses. I didn't want to just choose the sample randomly and have a vast majority of males in the sample. So one of the variables that I designated and controlled was 4 people per state, but I made sure I picked 2 random males and 2 random females. And that way, even though it didn't accurately represent the male-female makeup of the entire population, I thought it was worthwhile to have an equal representation. So there's give and take, There might have been 75% male ministers back then, but I thought it was more important to measure males and females equally. So you got to make those calls yourself, and it could be with anything. That's just one of the things I chose as important back then. Let's see. Yeah, so I thought having 4 representatives by state would give me the geological, or I guess that's a word, spread across the country that I wanted. So it wouldn't be concentrated in any one area. Now, that doesn't accurately represent the country either, because if you think about it, if you look at the whole center of our country, it has a very low population. And most of our population is either on the East Coast or the West Coast. And even on the East and West Coast, it surrounds cities. So you've got these bubbles around cities of really high concentrated population. And then you've got another bubble on the whole East Coast and another bubble on the whole West Coast. So that's another consideration I had to make. I had to say, okay, I'd rather represent every state equally versus high concentrated areas having many, many more people represented. So yeah, sometimes it's just your preference. It's what you think is important. So I wanted, I guess, more diversity throughout the country. So speaking of diversity, maybe certain types of diversity are important to you to measure. And maybe that will become one of your variables to control. And by diversity, it could be everything from, race, which is more obvious in multicultural counseling, but there's so many other aspects of diversity. It could be age, it could be gender preference, gender identity. It could be, it could be location. It could be personal experience. Has somebody had a traumatic event in their past? Could be when a diagnosis was made. Could be whether somebody's on medication or not on medication. So it's whatever's important to you in your own population. I can't really tell you what that is, but you have some examples. You can make that decision yourself. So that worked out well for me, I think. Let's see. So there are different types of sampling methods. And there's a chart in your book, and sometimes these sampling methods are on the COMPS or the NCE. So it's good to know these different sampling methods. And when you propose your study in your final paper, you're going to say, and I used a blank type sampling method with my population, So let's just look at the different types of sampling methods. And we'll talk a little bit about, we can narrow it down to 2 for your paper, and you can choose either one and you'll be right. Okay, so simple random sampling. Every single individual in the population has an equal chance of being chosen. That's almost impossible because we don't even know everybody in the population of a diagnosis. So, that's really, really difficult. I did know every single minister in the United States. I had a list of names, but I just chose not to do that because I wanted to include sex. I wanted to include location, things like that. All right. The second one, systematic random sampling. And so it says it's a finite list of those in the population where every nth person is selected. So what that means is that if you have everybody listed in a population and you put them on a spreadsheet and you simply pick a number at random, 7, 9, whatever, 22, and you just count down the list, and every 7th person, that's the person included. Every 9th person, whatever number you choose. It's a very simple way to randomize a sample, but once again, it has the same problem as total random sampling, that you probably don't know everybody in the population. That's the problem with it. All right, the third type is called stratified sampling. And a selection of individuals from the population who represent subgroups. So this ensures adequate representation on relevant variables. It may focus on a variable that's not as important as others. That could be a limitation. But that's what I used. So that's, me describing, okay, I wanted so many males, so many females, I wanted so many from each state. That is a stratified sampling. The next one, the last two are probably the two that you're going to use for your final paper. So you can pick one of these. So the first one is cluster sampling, a random selection of intact groups. So for example, classrooms. Classrooms are already an intact group. It allows the researcher to conduct studies with naturally intact groups. So a good way to view this is like, let's say you want to look at school districts, and you choose 3 different school districts and you're looking at middle schools, you would have intact groups in those school districts that you could use if you got permission. If you wanted to do something with like addictions and you were looking at Allegheny County and you went to all of the NA or AA programs and groups, they would be intact groups, even though the members change from week to week a little bit, it would still be considered an intact group. So that's a possibility for you. The last one is the easiest method, convenience sampling. A section of a population that is convenient, shouldn't define a word by itself, and accessible to the researcher. So, for example, if you work for an agency and the agency has 3,000 clients, and the agency gave you permission to work with those clients for your study, okay, that's a convenience sampling. That's the easiest. Another example would be like if I did a study at this university, that would be a convenience sampling. So a convenience sampling is really good if you have a connection with an agency, a university, a school system, something like that, and you had an accessible population that you wanted to use for your study, and they were going to give you permission. Like, I'm working with one of our previous students. I'm his LPC supervisor, and he's in a doctoral program at Duquesne, but he works for an agency and he has to do a dissertation. So he's thinking about, what are the needs of this agency? What are the needs of these clients? How can I help them better meet their counseling needs? So on one side, he wants to help his clients where he works. On another side, it's also going to benefit him if he can use them in his study. So that would be a convenience sampling. So let's just talk about this briefly, because you are going to include 2 things that we've just talked about in your final paper. You're going to choose, a sample of the population, and you're going to talk about what type of sampling are you going to use. So we've kind of narrowed it down to cluster or convenience sampling, and maybe some kind of area Western Pennsylvania, maybe a school district, a county, something like that. So, um, so Jack, I know you've already considered working with a certain county. So let's talk about that first, if you don't mind. Have you thought, because you were thinking about like Westmoreland County?
Yeah, I was thinking about Westmoreland.
Yeah. And so we're going to talk about helping people to better access all of the resources, including counseling resources in Westmoreland County. So as you're writing your lit review, your population is probably citizens of or residents of Westmoreland County. And are you defining them as like, how are you defining that population? People with mental health needs or general health and wellness needs? What were your thoughts on that part of it?
For this, I was going to focus on mental health more than general health, just because I feel like the mental health I could narrow it down a bit more,
Right.
and I feel like it'd be more relevant for this. Like general health, I'm like, oh, I don't know. There's Westmoreland Hospital's right there. Like,
Yeah. Yeah. Unfortunately. All right.
yeah,
So,
it's ran by the circus. Actually, it's terrible. Don't go there if you can avoid it.
all right. So let's think about how do you think you would get a sample for this proposed study? Like, would there maybe agencies in Westmoreland County, the hospital? Um, what were you thinking about? Maybe you weren't yet, but we can process it.
Well, now that you mention it, I was just thinking, and I don't know if it would be something, but let's say we're doing people who are using Medicaid, people on
Oh,
government insurance. So perhaps I don't, and again, I don't know if it would violate HIPAA to release that information, but I don't know if maybe the county assistant's office would have records on who all is using Medicaid.
so you could do Medicaid, Medicare, because they would both be similar populations. And they might, they would not be able to release those names to you, but they could probably send out an anonymous request to them offering services like say, hey, we've got this new program in Westmoreland County to help you find the resources that you need. Contact Jack, something like that. And then whoever contacted you, you could take your sample from that. Where you think, what, I don't even think you need any clusters, you know? You could just use whoever contacted you. If it was over a certain number, you could take a random sample of the responders, people who,
Yeah, like if there was let's say like a whole bunch of people that we could do clusters, of course it's always, but like yeah, I think if you're doing it based off responses, probably just best to not do clusters and just take from one group.
but if you were doing, were you thinking of a certain type?
I was going to do age groups.
Oh,
Uh,
yeah.
we're basically going to be split into child, adolescent, and then adults, because I know in Westmoreland sometimes therapists won't work with children; they'll only work with adults.
Yeah. Yeah. So you could take your whole sample of people who respond and you know, you can simply do like kind of a, not an intake, but when you're asking them their needs, how can I help you? You're going to get name, age, basic stats. So rather than stratifying it, you can just tally up their ages and report it in like descriptive statistics after you're done.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So honestly, if you would be able to do that, um, yeah, and that wouldn't even be clustered. Like that's even more like if you were gonna divide it up beforehand by age, that would be like stratified. Um, but I don't think you need to do either of them. So, you know, I think if you were able to send out this offer to provide resources, you know, through your local government agency, then you just go by respondents, basically, you know, and that would just be, I guess I would call it a convenience sampling, you know? So, I mean, technically, it's if you really want to get down to it, it's a cluster because it's everybody on Medicaid or Medicare, you know? So that's your intact group, but it's also your population. So, you know, I would rather refer to that as my population and do like a convenience sampling from that, the respondents from your population.
Okay.
So, yeah. Um, all right. So that sounds good. Um, all right. Who else wants to discuss maybe their idea? And we can just talk about what sampling, what population. Yeah.
Um, I was thinking just like for like pure number basis, somewhere like around Pittsburgh, maybe like Allegheny County would be a good one, especially just because I know the mental health is not the best, unfortunately, in Allegheny County.
Yeah.
And you know, a place that comes to mind around there is like Swanton Clinic, which would be a good one that's in Swiftly.
So you're the one you're doing the codependency with adolescents.
Yeah, yeah. Swanton Clinic takes like children, adolescents, adults, which would be really great.
Okay.
Do outpatient, inpatient, that kind of stuff. You know, they have a wide variety, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah. And you can basically volunteer to do free groups or something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that would work.
Yeah.
Yeah. That would be fine. Yeah. Do you think that would be cluster or convenience? I mean, you're going through a clinic, so
Right.
I'm thinking, yeah, it could be either one. Yeah. Yeah. If they're all going to like that one agency, I think that would be okay. All right. That sounds good. All right. Who else? We might as well get this done for you. What were you thinking about? Having, or let's see. We got Butch. I know what you were doing. I know you were doing your OCD and social media.
Yeah, I'm not super sure yet. I still have a lot I need to do on the lit review.
Yeah, that's okay. But you kind of have your population, you know.
Yeah, I do. I know I want to obviously specifically people with OCD, probably like a younger demographic, just because that's going to be the people that use social media the most often.
So think about it this way. What what resources would people with OCD be accessing already that maybe you could work through? And you don't have to answer me now, but maybe there are certain agencies that specialize in that or offer special services or something like that. Or you could even contact agencies and offer, you know, free groups or free individual counseling, and they could disseminate to their own clients, something like that.
Yeah, that would be cool. I was already interested in like seeing if there were any OCD specialists like places in the area because I feel like that would already be relevant to making my model. To, or at least to have like a place to recommend people go after they have this information.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. Well, that sounds good. All right. Who else wants to talk about it? We don't have to, but what were you thinking about, Taylor, about the autism thing?
I feel like we could go a few different ways. I think so we're working with elementary aged children with autism. So I feel like we could do a school for one option. Or I know like at some agencies they have programs. I can't think of the name on top of off my head. I know it's not early intervention, but there's supports coordinators.
Yeah.
Um, so we could either go do that also, but I feel like maybe leaning towards a school.
Yeah, so it'd either be like services that go into the home and work with really young kids or kids after school, or it would be in a school setting. And that would be your preference. Either would be okay.
Okay. And that would be a cluster then?
Yeah, because you're either going to work through a school or an agency.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Yeah. All right. So there's just one other thing to consider with sampling. And I don't know, I mean, it's your choice what you want to do with your proposed study. I mean, so everything I've mentioned so far has more to do with like qualitative. But you might want to do some quantitative. That's in case I didn't say that. So everything so far is more like quantitative. But you might want to do more qualitative stuff. And you don't need as large of a sample for qualitative. Remember, qualitative is like going into in-depth interviews, working with families or individuals, and spending a few hours at 3 different times talking with them. And you know, so I don't know how conducive your models would be for that. Um, but if you wanted to try it, I could help you write it up for your final paper if you wanted to. Um, all right. Let's see what else. Um, then the book provides some examples. So let's talk about measurements. So one of the things that you should probably be able to glean from your research, like let's say you read an article and they're studying your population, they probably used some kind of measurement, you know? So, you know, um, if they're studying depression, they might use Beck's depression inventory, or if they're studying anxiety, Beck's anxiety inventory, or if there's suicidality, maybe the Columbia assessment, or there's so many out there that are pretty famous that are kind of have become the go-to assessments, even like if you're assessing how much trauma somebody's experienced in their life, you could do the ACEs, you know, and but I would not make something up on my own. I've done that with a previous professor. It's a nightmare. Uh, because you gotta like, I mean, I'm not saying you personally, you don't have to do it for this class, but you have to figure out, okay, what's the reliability? What's the validity? And there's all different kinds of reliability and validity. And it's just really hard to get those stats. So it's so much easier if you picked one or two measurements, uh, for your population. Like, I don't know if there's an assessment for codependency. I don't know what that is. I'm sure there is something out there. Or maybe resiliency, you know. But think about, what would you use to see if your model helps these individuals, you know? So there might even be like a measurement for unhealthy and healthy relationships, you know? There might be measurements as far as the thing with autism spectrum, there's so many things included on that spectrum that I don't know if have you run across any kind of measurements or anything in any of the articles you're reading for that you might want to use to see, you know, if whatever model you're using kind of helps kids or not? Think about like some of the articles and see if they used any measurements. Because you were even talking about like those 3 types, like the communication, the behavior. So maybe even measurements in those three areas that you were thinking about. Jack, yours is going to be different because yours is kind of programmatic. So you're going to talk about measurements about how many more people were provided services, things like that. Which there's probably some kind of OCD measurement. There's probably even a social media measurement. How often do people use social media or something like that? There might even be an app that you could put on your phone. Like I have it for my kids, a screen time, you know, that measures how often they are on their social media or games or anything like that.
Yeah, I know they have apps for managing screen time, and I know there are existing measurements for OCD.
Yeah.
I
So
know.
I would just pick one of each. So you have like, you only need 2 measurements then.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good.
Anybody else? So if you're wondering about a measurement, there are a couple books that publish most of the popular measurements. The first one is called Tests in Print. That's the name of the book, Tests in Print. And the second one is Mental Measurements Yearbook, the Mental Measurements Yearbook. And between those 2 books, you should be able to find measurements for almost anything, all of the diagnoses at least. Now, not all of the measurements are free. That's, you know, but you don't have to include the measurement in your paper. All you need to do is include the name of the measurement you want to use, and it'll tell you what the reliability is. It'll tell you what the validity is, and you just quote it, you know, and put it in your paper. That's it. So you don't have to get into, like I would say each measurement is 1 paragraph, you know. So if you have 2 measurements, you write 1 paragraph about each. You don't need more than 2. You might only need 1, you know. So a paragraph per measurement, 2 measurements at the most. But you're going to include like, what's the measurement? What does it measure? What's its validity and reliability? But all that's already there for you. Okay. I'm more concerned about you writing, why are you choosing this measurement? You know, why this measurement? Sometimes it's obvious. Well, my studies on OCD, it measures OCD, you know, could be real obvious like that. But those are the 2. Okay. So the next thing is, I know it's already 6, but the next thing is basically, how are you going to give the measurement? And I would say almost in every single case in this class, you're going to give the measurement before you provide counseling and after you provide counseling. In your book, there's a chart of 3 different things. And basically, I would just basically do what's called, I mean, it's not even worth going through all of them, but I would just do pre-test, post-test. You give your measurement before, you give your measurement after, you see if there's a difference or not. That's it. So we're just going to keep that simple. That's what almost every study like this does. And you would write that, okay, this is how we're going to use the measurements. We're going to do pre-test, post-test. We're going to provide the measurement to all of the individuals, both not receiving counseling and receiving counseling, before and after, see if there's a difference. Dun, dun. I'm going to talk about validity and reliability in their own video next week. I want to separate them a little bit and go through all of the different, not only the types, but the threats, the problems that could arise. And you don't have to write about that in your paper because your measurements already have validity and reliability. So it's going to tell you what that is. But you kind of need to know that there's usually one question on the comps on reliability, and there's one question on validity. All right, I think that's it for tonight. Questions, comments? If anybody needs help with their lit review, make an appointment with me. Happy to help you with it. All right, we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Yeah.